A text out of context is a pretext, even when you're talking about gaming PCs. This is MultimediaJay radio style for Tuesday, March 7th, 2017. Let's start the show.
MultimediaJay radio style.
There's a saying in the Reformation circles I run in that a text without a context is a pretext. A pretext for what, you might ask? Bad interpretation of scriptures? Bad interpretation of ideas or other literary works? You know what? There's a secular counterpart to that too in our culture. Every single time someone posts a quote outside of context, because the quote, minus its context, resonates with somebody emotionally, and so they go parading the quote around everywhere, even though you don't have any idea where it's from or why the author wrote it. Sadly, numbers are not exempt from this either. This is actually one of the biggest fights I'm dealing with at the 9 to 5 right now, is numbers minus context, and the people who want to take shortcuts and not find out the why of the various numbers that exist in our business. I can't get away from it. I was talking to HR about it this morning. It's just people well, the numbers say this, that's it. And we don't want to know why. We don't want to know what drives the numbers or what we can do to make them better. Simple-minded laziness, I tell you. I wish I could say that the 9 to 5ers were an isolated instance of this, but that is far from the case. Now, I recently concluded my discussions about the launch of the AMD Ryzen and the smear job that the media is doing to the processor. So I want to focus more on just keeping your head on straight in the midst of all of this, because I actually listened to AdoredTV's monologue about how the media has treated the Ryzen's launch and all of this stuff being paraded around in the media. Oh, weak gaming performance. The gaming performance is weak. The workstation performance is cool, but the gaming performance is weak. Weak compared to what? And what is the context of this weak gaming performance? Now, AdoredTV did some really good explanations, so to speak. He did some really good exhibitions of how some of the methodologies used by the review community just haven't panned out. Like, for example, testing at lower resolutions as though it completely and always perfectly scales up at higher resolutions. So you can get an idea that lower resolution today means higher resolution performance tomorrow. That didn't pan out with the last couple of years of processor releases, and so it's quite reasonable to expect that we can't use that as a shortcut to figuring out whether Ryzen is worth it right now. But it is most unfortunate that Adored completely glossed over one of his own points. That is perhaps one of the most important points to make when talking about whether the Ryzen is still worth it or not. He talked about benchmarks under unrealistic conditions. Okay, so you take the performance of a processor at a lower screen resolution. Who is going to buy a high-end chip to play video games at 720p with hundreds of frames per second? I really wish that Adored had stayed on this point a little longer instead of barreling off into the numbers like he usually does, because it might have saved him from having to do said barreling through numbers. But hey, there are some people out there that want to barrel through numbers. In my case, though, I want to make sure the entire story gets told. And so we're going to focus on this point of unrealistic conditions, because this reminds me very much of what I'm dealing with every single time in recent weeks and months. I have encountered a situation where the numbers that people are throwing around have been utterly removed from their context. Now, I have a bunch of these horrible gaming benchmarks from TechSpot open for the Ryzen 7 right now. Let's look at some of these numbers here. But before we begin, let me talk about my own context with my own system. Here is my context. If you want to tell me yours, do so in the comments. My context is in regards to whether or not I should build a new system for gaming with a Ryzen processor, regardless of all the smearing in the media about weak gaming performance. My context is this. I am running a 1080p television from 2008 into the ground. It's 1080p. It's 60 hertz. My target for gaming with the hardware that I have is 1080-60 consistently. I have a system that sneezes at 1080-60 and can experiment with super scaling as an alternative to using anti-aliasing in PC games, but I am not convinced that it's worth it to super scale instead of using anti-aliasing and just cranking the graphics all the way in most games. I'll be doing some experimenting with that in WWMJ a little later on, but that is my context. 1080p 60, that's what I'm going for. It is also my context that I do not want to step backwards if I move up to a higher screen resolution. So, I'm currently at 60 Hz. This computer sneezes at 1080 60. I don't want to go back to 30 Hz, which is what would happen if I tried playing games in 4K. So even if I ran out tomorrow and picked up a 4K TV, my frame rates would drop. So basically, I'd be trading one good image for another. I'd rather have smooth animations in video games than going back to 30 FPS. Because I associate 30 FPS with consoles. And I'm not about to make something that's like Project Scorpio or anything when that's supposed to be coming out later on anyways. Which I imagine is probably going to be 4K no matter what the cost. So there are some people out there who love eye candy that much that they'll crank the eye candy even if it's 20 frames per second. I'm not one of those people. So before I even consider going to 4K for gaming, the hardware involved needs to be able to handle 4K 60. And I'm already at 4K 30. However, to go back to 4K 30 would be a step back in terms of the experience as far as I'm concerned, especially when I could sit a little further from the screen or something like that. Play 1080p games from the couch and not notice the jaggies as much or something along those lines. Obviously, in that case, it would have to be controller games with my setup, but that's my context. Feel free to share yours in the comments. Now, let's look at some of these benchmarks that allegedly, oh no, the Ryzen, it's weak. Yeah, let's take a look at some of these. So, TechSpot Watch Dogs 2 1080p Ultra with default settings, the minimum FPS for a 1700X for a Ryzen is 60. I get my 60 FPS from that. For 1700 without turning off SMT, I'd get 50-something minimum, which I can deal with 50 frames a second, but no lower. Preferably 55 to 60 to be, closer to 60 FPS than 30 FPS and stay out of console territory. It's interesting to note that the Pentium G4560 seems to struggle with some of these games. But let's keep on going here. I heard it was a nice cheap chip and stuff like that for 1080-60 because 1080-60 is borderline obsolete, blah, 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 blah. Arma 3, 1080p, 1700X, 67 minimum frame rate. Far Cry Primal, 1700X. Let's go to the lowest chip on the chart. 57 minimum frame rate. Let's see here. 1700X for Far Cry Primal. That would be 59 minimum frame rate. 1700X for Honor at 1080p, maxing everything out, 129. So again and again and again with these bar charts, I keep seeing again and again that the weak AMD Ryzen processor could actually get me 1080-60 gameplay and increase the oomph that I have with workstation tasks like crunching video or something along those lines. So that is how, a so-called side grade to Ryzen could actually be worth it for me. But notice what's going on here. Despite the smear job in the media, weak gaming performance, oh no! If you actually look at the hard numbers in the bar charts in articles like this, you'll find again and again, consider your context. If you're looking for 1080-60 without batting an eye, especially when you could stream and get better results with the extra cores in a Ryzen, because that's the one thing that these weak gaming performance articles don't seem to want to talk about. I mean, I missed it until I heard someone else say, and I'm like, oh yeah, streaming! That's traditionally a use for extra cores. Now consider this. Games programmed for quad-core as a baseline. You have lots of extra cores or threads available, then you have a lot more headroom for streaming in higher qualities if you have decent internet to do that sort of thing. But that's the thing here, is in the context of what I would use the Ryzen for, the Ryzen 7s are worth it. Hey, while we're at it, let's take a look at some of these FPS scores. I think these are averages from PC Gamer, from one of the articles that was actually being all negative. Ryzen, underwhelming gaming performance, great for video editors, not so much for gamers. Okay, Ashes of the Singularity DirectX 12, 1080p Extreme, I think these are average FPSs though, but Ryzen 7 1700, the one that I wanted to get, average 6170. I don't know what the breakdown is in that respect, but 6170. Let's continue onward. Battlefield 1 1080p Ultra. The 1700 be 140. So again, in all of these cases so far, I could switch to a Ryzen 7 tomorrow and get the performance that I'm looking for to do 1080-60 on this display. Not really much headroom for super scaling or anything, but the graphics card would need to take that over. Plus, the graphics card becomes more of a bottleneck at higher resolutions. So anyways, let's see here. Civ 6. Finally, something, oh no, 62. What is it? This is DX12 1080 Ultra averaging 62. Even the 8370 could get me into the 50s, but it's just, the punch is there. Deus Ex Mankind Divided, DX12, 1080p very high, the Ryzen 1700 7890. So, despite the so-called weak gaming performance, I keep seeing benchmark after benchmark, after benchmark, after benchmark, after benchmark, where the number, either minimum or average FPS, suggests to me that the weak gaming processor might actually be able to properly work in my kind of setup and bring some more muscle to the table for editing videos and other stuff like that to boot and speed things up that way. But that's the thing. What I've just done here is I've taken these numbers as they were presented in these articles about, oh no, the Ryzen's weak, and I've put them back in their proper context. Specifically, the context of my setup. The context of other people's setups might differ if they're going for a 4K setup, but consider this. AMD has committed to socket AM4 for the duration of the Ryzen's life cycle until 2020. Suppose they work the bugs out in Ryzen Generation 2, and then you can upgrade just your processor and keep everything else and fix all of this in a year or two. Yeah, we might see some old Ryzen chips floating around eBay very, very shortly, perhaps even years before their time, but people are talking about, no, weak performance, again, in the context of the usual rules of guts upgrades in computers, that it always needs to be motherboard, processor, and RAM all getting upgraded at the same time, because time and again, things advance enough that you want to upgrade all three at the same time and not just one of them, or something along those lines. And if it is one of them, it's RAM, the so-called poor man's upgrade. But that's the thing. This whole dynamic is changing with these commitments to be for AMD to be AM4 until 2020. The old rules don't apply here, but don't try telling the media that. As usual, if it bleeds, it leads. If it's FUD, it's whatever. But yeah, whatever it takes to get people to read these articles these days, huh? The unfortunate news, the unfortunate other part of the story, I should say, is that people are going to see this and they're going to react to it. And they may not react to it in the way that these news organizations want. But yes, folks, to keep your heads on straight, whenever you see these big headlines, weak gaming performance, look at these numbers, they're terrible. Especially percents. Percents are very useful for making people think something's bigger or smaller than it actually is. Just because percents can scale doesn't mean that percents are cure-all for the problems with presenting numbers. I mean, I can, for example, go from 10 to 12 and say, look, 20% better. It's a marketing thing. Percents are used to ooh and ah people like you wouldn't believe. And quite frankly, anybody who catches on to that is going to pick that up immediately if you try and pull that kind of a stunt there. But seriously, enough's enough already. Folks, keep your head on straight by not just taking people's words for things. Look at what's presented in those graphs. And in the case of the weak gaming performance, ask yourself this one question. If I went and got a Ryzen now, would I be able to get what I'm looking for? If the answer is yes, no matter what some media, whatever, tells you, it's worth the purchase. Especially, if you want to upgrade later or something like that, and you won't have to upgrade the guts of the processor or the guts of your system all in one shot. And this, folks, is the rest of the story behind that unrealistic circumstances point that AdoredTV glossed over. Doesn't matter, though. He made plenty of good points in other areas that had more to do with the numbers. But even without going barreling headfirst into the numbers, there is still plenty of reasons to second-guess what so many folks in the tech media did this past weekend. I want the Ryzen to have a fair shake and a fair shot, because this industry needs the competition. So this whole thing of, oh no, it's weak. Plus, must we mention again the pathetic hypocrisy of not too long ago, yeah, you don't need a powerful processor to game. Don't be an idiot and spend a lot of money on the CPU. You don't need a powerful processor to game. And then, oh my goodness, the Ryzen's not a powerful gaming processor. It's hopeless. It's over for AMD. Blah, blah, blah. Give me a break. Seriously, can we make up our minds on anything? Fanboys will be fanboys, even when they're trying to look professional, because they work in tech media. This is MultimediaJay, signing off. Thanks for stopping by.